So have you heard about the dog and fox hybrid found in Brazil? Well, I had neither, but a student of mine in my genetics class sent me an email. They're like, Dr. Duff, can you talk about this dog, fox? Oh, what is this, a Dr. Seuss episode? So these are going to completely confuse me. A dog and a fox hybrid? Maybe you could talk about that. What's up with that? How does the genetics of that work? So they sent me the link, and sure, I was very interested because I thought, you know what? I know a certain person, a certain group of people down there in Kentucky who will probably pick up on this story and have a little something to say about it. So let's just talk about it in anticipation of what a certain somebody in Kentucky is going to say. All right. So I looked into it, found out about what this fox dog hybrid is. I'll tell you about the evidence that the hybrid exists, and then I'll tell you about how it's not quite as dramatic as the stories make it sound. Yep, here's a bunch of recent headlines about it. Now, it turns out, actually, this was found in 2021. I don't remember if I heard about it then, but apparently this hybrid has died since then, and so it came back up in the news just a couple days ago. And there's been a paper written about that hybrid, and a scientific paper, which looks at the chromosomes of the two to find evidence that it is, in fact, an actual hybrid, not just a dog that kind of looks like a mixture of a fox and a dog, and a little bit of other DNA analysis of the mitochondrial genome. And just to give away a little bit of the story, yes, this does seem to be a true hybrid, but a hybrid between what? What species of fox? And what do we mean by a fox? That's what I think is interesting here. Is what is the meaning of fox in terms of taxonomic language? All right, so let's dig into it. What about this dog and fox hybrid? It's going to give me a chance to talk about canines again. Canine relationships, canine speciation, and the origin of canines. Got all that stuff coming up next. All righty, let's just get cracking right to the main point. What was the hybrid that was discovered? As I said, I read the paper. I'm not going to show you that scientific paper. I'll just tell you what the results are. And the results are this. They looked at the chromosomes of this particular individual. What they found is it has 77 chromosomes. 77 chromosomes. Kind of a weird number, right? An odd number. Typically, numbers of chromosomes for a diploid organism, like you and I, we have 46 chromosomes, would be an even number, not an odd number. So that's one thing that sticks out right away, is having an odd number of chromosomes. So how do you get an odd number of chromosomes? Well, here I'm showing you all the different living canine species. And you might not be able to read all the names, but that's not what's important here. This is showing a phylogeny, how they're related genetically, all these different dogs. And let me get out. And of course, ones you're most familiar with, of course, would be the gray wolf. Down here, we've got the coyote. I think gray wolves and coyotes are very closely related. We think that they're sister taxa to each other, meaning they have the most recent common ancestor. They both have 78 chromosomes. And likewise, we think of domesticated dogs as being a subset of gray wolves, a branch off of gray wolves, and they also have 78 chromosomes. So all your domesticated dogs, no matter what the different sizes they are, they have 78 chromosomes. And then we go up and we look at the Pampas fox. And I'm just going to use the laser pointer. The Pampas fox right here. This is the fox that is presumed to have hybridized with a domesticated dog. Now, in Brazil, there are many, many, many feral dogs. And what kind of canines are native to South America? There's a number of them, a lot of them in this particular group that you're looking at. I think Darwin's fox, the maned wolf, but the Pampas fox right here, that's the fox that is the hybrid with the dog. Now, it has 76 chromosomes. Now, what happens when you do sexual reproduction? You have to separate the chromosomes into one half set, all right? One set of chromosomes instead of two. So 76 divided by 2 is what, 38? And if you start out with 78 chromosomes like you do in a domesticated dog, and you separate those, you're going to end up with a sperm or an egg In this case, it's thought that, oh, I'm trying to remember now. I believe that it was I think it's domesticated dog is the male. And so in domesticated dogs, they have 78 chromosomes. And when you separate those chromosomes into one set, you're going to have what? You're going to have 39 chromosomes in the sperm or the egg. In this case, it would be the sperm, because this paper shows that it was a male domesticated dog or feral dog that mated with a female Pampas fox. Now, how do they know that? Because they looked at the mitochondrial genome. And they sequenced the mitochondrial genome from this particular hybrid, and they discovered that it fits. The mitochondrial genome is the mitochondrial genome of a Pampas fox and not the mitochondrial genome of domesticated dogs. And so therefore, the donor for this particular dog was a female, because mitochondrial genomes get passed down through the female lineage. Right, so you take those 39 chromosomes from the male in the sperm and you mix those with 38 chromosomes from the female, and you're going to get what? You're going to get 77 chromosomes. Now that means they have an odd number. So if this this dog-fox hybrid ever tried to reproduce with either a Pampas fox or a feral dog, right? When it goes to make its sex cells and it tries to divide it in half, you can't divide 77 in half, right? Which means it's going to make some sperm. I believe this was a male. It's going to make some sperm that is going to have, some of them are going to have 38, and some will have 39, right? One sperm will have 38, the other one will have 39, because they're going to be missing one chromosome in one of them. Or alternatively, you can think of it as having an extra chromosome in the other one. And then when that mixes back with whatever it tries to mate with, it's going to create an instability there, because you're either going to have an extra chromosomes, you're going to have a trisomy situation where you have 3 chromosomes, or you're going to have a situation of monosomy, which means you only have 1 copy of your genome. This creates an imbalance in the number of copies of genes, which then creates imbalances typically in development. Just think of trisomy 21 in human beings, Down syndrome. That's just the effect of having an extra chromosome. There aren't any missing genes. There's just too many copies of some of the genes that create issues. In fact, trisomy 20 is lethal. And so nobody's ever born with trisomy 20. It creates so many problems. So it's very unlikely that this particular hybrid would ever be able to cross back into either of its parental lineages and have a successful hybrid. In other words, it's sterile. Nonetheless, sure does look like a real case of a hybrid between a domesticated dog, and a fox. And it could be the first example of a fox and a dog, or a wolf-like member of the canine. Now, here's where I need to tell you that the story isn't quite as dramatic as it sounds. And it's not as dramatic as what I think Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham down in Kentucky, when they talk about this, if they talk about it, but I think they will. They're going to make this sound really dramatic, because they're going to say, like, this shows that all foxes and wolves, the other members of the canine family, all foxes and wolves all must have come from a common ancestor, which is what they've been saying. It's what Ken Ham's been saying. If you go back to Noah's Ark, there was 2 canines on the ark, and then they became all the different living canines, which they would include as being foxes and wolves. Now, up to this point, I have been saying in the past, look, there's no evidence that foxes are really different. They really are quite different than other wolves. Now, when I refer to foxes, I'm typically referring to, let's go to our little tree here, I'm referring to this portion of our phylogenetic tree. And you notice if you trace them back to a common ancestor here, they all are members of the same kind of group of things. And these are the true foxes, right? At least that's what I would label them. And I thought a canine taxonomist would say, these are the true foxes, the Vulpes genus, right? Members of that genus, all very similar to one another and have the true fox-like characteristics. Now, so why are some of these called foxes down here? Well, they have fox-like traits or characteristics. And so they are quite similar to the foxes, but they don't they're not actually in the group of the true foxes. In fact, they are actually more closely related. If you follow your phylogenetic tree down here to this common ancestor, this group of things that includes some things called foxes is more closely related to this group of things that includes the gray wolf and the coyote. So the distance between your domesticated dog and a true fox, and the one I would pick out to use would be the red fox, because that's a really common one. This is not evidence of a red fox mating with a domesticated dog. And I've already seen pictures that people have posted in which they're not showing a Pampas fox. They just picked out a fox, right? And if you just go to the internet and pick out a fox, you're getting a red fox. A red fox is very genetically distinct from a Pampas fox. For one thing, notice the chromosome numbers. All right? Now, the red fox only has 34 chromosomes. 34 chromosomes. They have about the same amount of genetic information. Their chromosomes are much bigger. But nonetheless, that means their chromosomes are rearrangements, very drastic rearrangements of what was the original common ancestor chromosomes. Right? So they are quite dramatically different. And you imagine something crossing with 34 chromosomes, it's going to make what that's 17. Got to do quick math there. Hard math, 34 divided by 2. You got 17 chromosomes. And you're going to mix that with a domesticated dog that's donating 39 chromosomes. Then you got quite a hodgepodge of chromosomes. You might have sort of the right genetic mix of alleles. I'm not saying it's impossible. There are wild combinations of organisms that have very different chromosomes that it can still are still compatible. Now, by compatible, I only mean that they can make a viable organism. But almost always that organism is sterile. It is incapable of producing another generation. So that's the end of the line. So effectively, those two different species aren't really mixing their genomes, right? They are in an individual, but because that individual can't backcross and mate with any of their original parents or parental populations, it never mixes the genes into that other population. Unlike what gray wolves and coyotes can do, right? They're similar enough. They both have 78 chromosomes. They have the same genes, right? They can mix together and they can produce a combo of a coy wolf, right? And they can cross back with their original parent population, in which case they can transport genes from one species to the other doing a mixing, all right? All right, so my main point here is this. I want to make sure everyone catches this. The domesticated dog times a fox is pretty wild. It's pretty amazing, right? That's quite a genetic difference. It's quite a genetic gulf. It does show that there is enough similarity between those genomes that they kind of recognize each other and can work with each other to make a living organism. But it's not quite as dramatic as some of the news reports are, and what I think creationists will try to pronounce this as. Like, look, you all the way across the boundaries of all canines, this shows that they can all mix with each other. Right now, we can show that a lot of different true foxes can hybridize with each other. Right. And then there are clearly hybridization events between some of the members of this group in here, which you notice they're not all called foxes. All right. You have the short-eared dog, you have the bush dog, and the maned wolf. These are common names, right? This is just what people think of when they see these things, that this looks wolf-like versus fox-like. And so it's showing that they're kind of have an intermediate characteristics, which kind of makes sense since they're sort of, intermediate, right, between the true foxes and the wolves. Anyone who knows their phylogenies really well will know that I'm speaking out of turn there a little bit, because of course you can, just for you science nerds, you can flip this node right here around and you could put this group below and you could put the wolves on top. Nonetheless, the group altogether shares a common ancestor. And so you would think that it would share a number of different common characteristics with each other relative to the foxes, right? So the foxes are outside of that. They're older, likely older in terms of their origins than these other two. All right, so that's the first thing I discovered when I read the paper. I asked myself right away, wow, really? Like a real fox mixing with a domesticated dog? And what I found out right away was it's not actually a real fox. I mean, it's not an incorrect headline. This is called the Pampas Fox. It is a fox-like species, and it did cross with a domesticated dog. I'm convinced by the evidence that this really is a hybrid. No problem there. All right, so now let's review a little of the young Earth creationist perspective on this before they talk about it. And then let's explore a few more things about canine evolution or canine origins and how we can use this hybrid to sort of explore some things. And so this comes from an article called Reimagining the Archkinds. This is way back when the Ark Encounter was about to open, and they wrote a bunch of articles about like, here's what we're going to be displaying on the Ark. And what they were trying to do is warn their audience. Okay, it's like, yeah, I got to tell you, you know what, when you come to this our new Ark thing we're going to open up, and you walk through the Ark, we're going to have these displays, and they're going to have animals in them. And the animals represent the Archkinds. So what's an Archkind? An Archkind would be the representatives that Noah brought on the ark to be the saved, preserved members of each kind of land-breathing vertebrate, air-breathing vertebrate. And what they're saying is, look, you know, we've been talking lately about how like a kind is like kind of like at the level of a family classification level. So canines, felines, bears, horses, equines. And so what was on the ark is a representative of all those species. It has to be a representative of foxes and wolves because they originated from a common ancestor that was on the ark. So that common ancestor, that pair, then gave rise to all this different divergence. So then they have a little problem, right? It's like not really a problem, but they have something they need to determine. How are we going to display what that ark kind looked like? It wouldn't look like a coyote. It wouldn't be a red fox, right? Because it has to have contained all the genetic information to make all of those different kinds of canines. So therefore, it must be some amalgam of all those critters. Now, what they end up doing is, interestingly, they actually go to the fossil record and they go to paleontologists who've looked at like the history of canines from an evolutionary perspective, and say like, here's the oldest fossils we know of a canine, and here's our reconstruction of what that canine looked like. In other words, the common ancestor to all canines. And they have modeled, this is what Answers in Genesis did, they modeled most of their archkinds off of paleontologists, evolutionary paleontologists. They used their work of recreating the original types of each different type of family of organism. So the original cat kind, the original dog, the original bear, the original giraffe. The original giraffe had a short neck on the ark, not a long neck. So that's why they called it reimagining the ark kinds. And they kind of needed to warn their audience, because I've been to the ark and I've stood there by these cages with these crazy looking animals that look nothing like anything around today. Like, what did that original giraffe look like? Well, it didn't have a long neck, but it had like a patchy pattern and had the ossicles and kind of like a mixture of an okapi and a giraffe because they're related animals. And I've heard the kids say, "Mama, what is that thing in that cage? Like, what is that?" And parents are like, okay, let me read this label over here. Oh, that's a giraffe, right? That's the giraffe kind. That's what giraffes used to look like. And then I'm sure they're like, "Oh, really? I mean, I thought God just made giraffes." Actually, in the young Earth creationist literature that's older than this, they make a big deal about how giraffes are so special with their long necks and special features that God must have just made giraffes exactly the way we see them. But now, no. Giraffes didn't have long necks. They had shorter necks on the ark, and then they developed those longer necks later because they had the potential to do so after the flood. Okay, I'm going on a long side tangent. We haven't even read what I've got sitting here in front of me here, because let's go back to dogs. The canine dog kind represents an interesting challenge. Their variety of shapes and sizes is extraordinary. I agree, right? There's a lot of differences between foxes and wolves and even coyotes. Think of the tiny Chihuahua, the massive Great Dane. That's a terrible example of the great, variety. I mean, morphologically, externally, yeah, they really look very different. But genetically, they're very similar to one another. I mean, they're just barely different types of wolves. Now add coyotes, wolves, dingoes, jackals, extinct subfamilies such as the Hesperocyaninae and the Boraphaginae. I'm terrible with the Latin names. I'm a taxonomist. It's really embarrassing that I can't read Latin names, but it's just the way it is. How could we ever decide how to depict the ARC dogs? Yes, good question. And what about those extinct subfamilies? Are they part of the canines too, even though none of them are living today? Well, we're going to get to that. I think that's pretty interesting. A recent study on ARC mammals, published in the Answers Research Journal, concluded that foxes are even part of the dog kind, despite large differences in chromosome numbers. I just showed you that. 34 chromosomes in a red fox, 78 chromosomes in your domesticated dog. Right. Although no known crosses between dogs and foxes exist today, all right, this article was written a few years ago, their anatomy is very similar, and a handful of seemingly reliable reports of hybrid dachses were recorded in the past 2 centuries. I looked up those. They are not reliable resources. At least the place that talks about these, if Answers in Genesis wants to believe those reports, they should just scan down and look at the other reports. Like they report, like these same places that are reporting these have examples of like a dog crossed with a sheep. Look at this. We have this weird little sheep-like thing that has like a dog-looking face. A dog mixed with a pig, or a dog with this. I mean, they have reports of dogs mixing with like virtually every other mammal. That in a young Earth creationist model can't happen because they're in different kinds. Different kinds can't cross with each other. If there was evidence that 2 different kinds cross with each other, that would be evidence they are the same kind. Because their models, their understanding of what a kind is based on, or many of them are based on, reproductive success between the two, hybridization. So they would have to like discount most of the other reports on some of these websites in order to accept, right, these 2 sites. Anyway, we're at a stage now where we could say, yes, there seem to be some evidence of a fox and a dog crossing, except as I just pointed out, it's not really true foxes. Once again, the fossil record is indispensable. It is indispensable. That's how they're going to create their ARC kinds. At the ARC counter, we modeled our dog after Hespericion, which is in that extinct subfamily. And that's the picture of the dog. Actually, that's the recreated dog that they have on the ARC encounter. It's an extinct canine that paleontologists say is likely similar to, or is a common ancestor in the lineage of common ancestors of all the living canines today. It's an extinct canid thought to have risen, given rise to the 3 major subfamilies of the Canidae. I'm going to show you the 3 major subfamilies in a moment. It weighed less than 4 pounds and had a tail as long as its slender body. Less than 4 pounds? It's a tiny little thing. In other words, canines started out as very tiny creatures, kind of like, related to something like rats and other, and we'd have to go into carnivore evolution and all that, but very small animals, little tree living animals. And so the history of the canine family is starting with these small-bodied animals with long tails and shorter legs. And then as you look in the fossil record, they become more and more and more like the canines that you're familiar with today. And so what they show on the ARC, you can better bet, that people walk by and are like, "Yeah, that's kind of weird. That doesn't look like any kind of dog today." All right, so let's look at some of those subfamilies. All right, so here are the 3 main groups of subfamilies. So cladists, classificationists, taxonomists, they would place all the canine family into this broad group that includes these 3 subfamilies, subgroups. And they're subgroups because they're related groups to each other, right? But they would say like all share a common ancestor. And so all the way over there, all right, all the way over here on the left is this creature right here. This is a suggested like appearance for that particular dog. And I don't know about you and I, but if you showed me that and you said like, okay, what kind of carnivore is that? I'd probably be more tempted to call that a cat, right? All right. Or maybe there's some other kinds of carnivores that also have this kind of look too. Maybe some of the muscelids or something like that, weasels. So yeah, dogs have come a long way. in terms of their changes. All right, so what we're talking about in terms of crossing a dog and a fox actually only represents Canis and not Vulpes, right? It represents Canis and these two groups over here, which are the most similar to each other today, the most recent branch of the history of canines. And now we've found one example of a cross between those most recent divided subgroups of one subfamily. Right? So all these other ones are extinct. And I'm saying there's at least 40 of that first subgroup. There's at least 66 named species of the second group. And there's more than 75 species of canines. There's 35 living ones, but there's a whole bunch of extinct ones too. Other relatives that are no longer around today. That's what, 60 animals, 100, that's 180 species. 180 different kinds of canines. And what Ken Ham is saying is all of these are the same kind, all came from just two animals. I think it's incredibly dramatic. It's a huge amount of evolution. It's hyperevolution. It's young earth evolution. To say that just the canine subgroup that includes foxes and dogs all came from a common ancestor just 4,000 years ago. It's actually so utterly ridiculous. It seems ridiculous to even talk about it. But I have to talk about it because lots of people believe this and think that this is just like, oh, yeah, I guess that could happen. But it sounds like utter nonsense to somebody who knows like some biology, some genetics, population genetics. So, but I'll make the further point here that in these groups, let's see what I got. Yeah. In these groups, when did all these have to have evolved in the young earth creationist model? Right? There are red foxes, right, which are the more extreme foxes, Maine wolves, coyotes, wolves, like all the major types of parts of the subfamily that we see alive today. There is a fossil record of those going back to before the Ice Age. Young earth creationists say the Ice Age occurred only 300 years after the flood. So that means all of these groups here, all member species of all of these genre as the name genes might say, all the members here, there had to be members of them already present in their current like morphology, their current shapes and looks, right? They all had to have existed prior to the Ice Age in order for us to have fossils of them from before the Ice Age. And so from young earth creationist perspective, that means they had to go from a common ancestor to just two dogs on the ark to all these different genera, to foxes, wolves, coyotes, and Maine wolves, and Darwin's fox, and so forth, Pampas fox. All of those had to have formed within just like 200 years, right? Within just a couple generations. Ultra fast evolution. That sounds wild, but now that you pull back and look at the big picture, which I don't think that Ken Ham has ever, anyone at Answers in Genesis ever sat down and even looked at this and thought about this and thought what they're saying. But now let's pull back and let's ask, what about all these other fossils? All of these are extinct, and they've all been extinct since before the last Ice Age. All these fossils are found in sediments that are below layers that we would recognize as being caused by a recent Ice Age. So for Answers in Genesis, all of these 100 other species all had to have formed from a common ancestor and then gone extinct, all right, within 200 years. And enough individuals had to have lived for them to become fossilized. And how hard is it to fossilize? Answers in Genesis tells us it's really, 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 really hard to become a fossil. Only a giant flood could cause this, except this was after the flood. And so they would admit it's an extremely rare event that something would get fossilized in a post-flood environment. So I would suggest there had to be hundreds of thousands of individuals from each of these species, each of these genera, in order to get a couple of them preserved and for us to find them and be able to name them and identify them, even though we've never seen one alive. Right? How different do you think these are genetically too? I mean, look at that. Look at this thing over here. It's quite different. Right? You think that could hybridize with a modern dog? Right? It's hard enough to find the ability for them to hybridize even among just this one little subgroup over here, much less across the entire group. Right? So the picture's not a pretty picture. Let's look at this in another way. Here's what paleontologists have done by looking at lots and lots and lots of fossils over the whole world. They can draw these diagrams that show relative abundance of different species at different times. And so this subfamily, and you see how this orange goes back 40 million years. So they're drawing out like in the geological column with traditional dating methods. How far back do they go? Well, you see the very first things that you could possibly call a dog. It seems to have characteristics in terms of its anatomy that are dog-like, canine-like compared to all the other carnivores. So it's like, yeah, this is the thing that it seems to have the most similarity to our modern dogs. So that thing I showed you a picture of earlier. And then there's just one in the fossil record, right? One species. And then later in time, a few million years later, we have several species that are still members of this group. They're similar to one another, but they look like they're different species. And then they begin to really explode, all right? And so now we have 10 to 15 different species living at the same time in the world, just like we have 35 different species today. But we then have a decline of that particular subgroup. Why? Because it looks like there was a member of a different subgroup. So there's a branching going on. And then so one member of that group evolved different enough traits and gave rise to other species. And we said they're different enough that we're going to put them in a different genera, which eventually becomes a different subfamily the longer the time passes. And so this other subfamily then develops and it gains more and more species, and to the point where on the Earth at one time there is a whole bunch of this subfamily, some species of this subfamily, and like only one of the modern subfamily. And so that original modern subfamily species kind of hung on for a while. Maybe it was being outcompeted by the others, but eventually it evolved characteristics that maybe outcompeted the other subfamilies, and it started to become more common. And the other subfamilies dropped off to the point where they just went extinct. Every single member of those subfamilies disappeared. Right? This is all after the flood. This isn't caused by Noah's flood. Although, go to Institute for Creation Research, I have no idea how they're going to explain this, because this thing crosses right over their boundary of where the flood and the post-flood is. It was super messy for them. It's impossible for them to deal with. Right? But eventually you get the modern canines. Anyway, that's the picture of the changes in diversity over time. And so what I want to emphasize to you is this means, from the creationist perspective, they're saying that down here lower in the fossil record, you see these species as part of this subfamily, and then you start to see later on more of this other subfamily, and then eventually you see mostly the other subfamily. Eventually the other two disappear, and the top of the fossil record, we only find modern canines. But even all of those we find as far back as the last ice age. But for young Earth creationists, they have to compact all of that into just a couple 100-year time frame, because they have to squish it all between the flood. Because they would say the flood is before there's no diversity of canine. Well, there might have been diversity before, but we don't have any fossils of them. They would admit that. We don't have any fossils of canines before the flood. But we know that, they would say, we know that 2 canines stepped off the ark. And there could only have been one species to start out with. And so this makes sense that you would start out with a first appearance after the flood. And then gradually there's more species. But by not very long, you've got many, 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 many species living on Earth at one time. That all has to be compacted into a couple 100 years. All right, so you might wonder, well, why don't they just put those in another those subfamily members? Why don't they just call those different kinds and just say like, there was 2 of each of those, there was 2 of those, there were 2 canines on the ark, because that could solve some of the problems I just created for them. Right? Maybe after they watch this video, they'll do that, because they realize, oh, man, we can't fit all that variation into one kind. Maybe we should split them up. As of now, not. I mean, I checked the list at the Ark Encounter. Right? They've got this display, and I'm only showing you part of it. All these are extinct. You can't read these names, but every one of these lines is a different family name. So each family includes many genera and many species. So anywhere from a couple species to hundreds of species. They're utterly extinct today. Every single one of these. Those two subfamilies are not on this list. In other words, they're including those subfamilies in the canine family that is still a living family. And it's on the other list of living things. I'm only showing you half of the extinct mammal kinds, by the way. Isn't that amazing? There's like 250 mammal kinds of families that are completely extinct today. So they were all on the ark, they got off the ark, and they all went extinct in some short period of time, like almost all before the Ice Age. So within 200 years, boom, they're gone. That is a huge extinction problem. Last thing, I'm just going to show you a couple figures. These are updated figures of phylogenies of modern, of living, well, mostly living. Actually, can I say that? About half living, half extinct species. I want to show you that even the living species are subdivided into 3 subgroups. The subfamily Canini, which is the living subfamily of canines, is divided into 3 groups, right? Those 3 groups are the Vulpini, the Vulpines, or what I've been calling the true foxes. Then you have this unpronounceable name right here. This group includes Lecopteryx, which is the Pampas Fox, all right? So that fox is in here. And then down here we have our wolves and coyotes. There's a whole bunch of different canis species, and most of them are extinct. And then this is mapped onto how old they are. And what's interesting here is the dark bars, all right, the thicker bars represent the fossil record. You know, like we know we have fossils that go from 5 million up to, you know, like 1 million years ago for this particular species. And you see with these up here, these are the other subfamily, a couple members of the other subfamily. And we have fossils back here at 30 million years. And then we have fossils of a different species that span quite a range, actually more than almost 10 million years. Fossils of other species, fossils of other species. So the other subfamilies are found deeper in the fossil record. Then we have the modern species that are alive today. And eventually you'll see that the canines that you and I know, foxes, coyotes and wolves, all right, and domesticated dogs, they're all like super young. They're in the very, 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 very tippy top of the fossil record. Although even these have fossils that go back more than 1 million years, which means they go back before the Ice Age, right? Which is like 20,000 to 50,000 years ago. Actually, I can expand this. I meant to do that. Let's look at the modern wolves. So down here you've got, oh, actually it's below here. This one right here, Lycopex griseus, that is the Panax fox. All these ones with these funny symbols next to them right here, those are all extinct. So those are all extinct species. Extinct, 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 extinct. All this is extinct up here, and everything above it is extinct. So we have fossil members of these. All right, so this gives you it's a nice graphical view of where in the fossil record you find these things, and you can kind of see when you look at it in this perspective, you can see how species come into existence and then disappear in the fossil record. They're replaced by other ones which take the lineage on, and then they disappear, and there's other ones that go on and so forth, and they're just constantly branching out, disappearing, and more branching out over time. All right, so yeah, interesting. All right, pretty interesting that you've got a fox-like canine crossing with a wolf, right? Because domesticated dogs are wolves. And as I said before, I think the cytological evidence, the chromosomal evidence, is very compelling. And they sequence the mitochondrial genome, and so they know that the mitochondrial genome is a Panax. I mean, is a fox, right? This other fox, and that was very compelling. But clearly has dog-like features as well. So you can see that in the nuclear genome, there's a mixture of characteristics, right? The two genomes had to kind of battle it out to figure out like how we're going to share these characteristics to make this hybrid halfway in between thing. So, you know, for young Earth creationists, it is more evidence that there is potential hybridization between distant lineages. And in their minds, that means they have to be in members of the same created kind, because they can't allow for any kind of crossing between members of different kinds, because that would suggest that they're somehow genetically related, like by common ancestor. Because they recognize that, like, why can they hybridize? Because they had a common ancestor. One time they had a common genome. They had the same genome. That same genome has diverged into two separate genomes, but not so much that they can't still recognize each other and make a hybrid between the two. All right, that's all I've got. Oh, then there's my, the brown dog there is Calvin, and he's a golden doodle. And the little puppy at the time, who's now 3 years old, but was probably only 6 months old here, is my old English sheepdog named London, who liked to pester my golden doodle. They have a lot of fun together, and now they're pretty much pals. Typically, they're usually lying right here next to me, but right now they're not. I don't know where they're at. One of the kids have them. All right, that's it. That's it for me. Subscribe, like. Love having you here, and we'll think of something to say soon. So we'll talk to you later. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.